on the graying of the American population?
Well, yeah, just to frame it and just give people some, I mean, I'm sure that this was the same for you too, Jeff. We're similar in age. That, you know, growing up, there was always, this ticking time bomb with the so-called, you know, unfunded entitlements. But I mean, it's at the point now, the mismatch, in case the listeners don't know this, that it was back in 2008 when, you know, with the financial crisis and the so-called Great Recession, that's when the workers' so-called contributions to Social Security, OA, SDI, that was insufficient to cover the outgoing checks. And that's when that mismatch first happened. And then, you know, they talk about the so-called trust fund. And again, there's problems with that, but even on its own terms, in terms of like the internal accounting, that's going to run out for Social Security like 2030s at this point, early 2030s. So, I mean, these things that when I was growing up were always some problem that's going to, you know, rear its head in 50 years. And gee, maybe we should start doing something about that. But, you know, it's already upon us. And so this is going forward going to be one of the things, especially as interest rates rise, where it's going to become more apparent. So, yeah, I think that these issues that so far isn't happening in Canada, where there's this sort of trend that I think they floated a trial balloon and then backed off when there was public outcry, but to say, well, hey, if the government's paying for all these medical expenses and there's people that can't be treated, whatever, you know, maybe if you just took your own life, wouldn't that be better for everyone? This Japanese guy explicitly saying it in the case of Japan, and I went and looked, I don't know if you did this, Jeff, to see the actual clip when he did it on this show, and it was a bunch of young people, and I don't speak Japanese, but he obviously said the line, and everyone started like, oh, and they were like laughing and kind of like shocked, but it was very, you know, funny, like hey, that's really the only solution here, am I right? And so I think that attitude is, we're going to see it more and more here as this just becomes untenable. Like, how are we going to pay for all these people? And gee, would it just, instead of, you know, grandpa burning $600,000 worth of expenses on 3 years of life that really aren't very good for him anyway, would it just be better for everybody if he took the high road?
Well, and to be fair, old people in Japan, old people in America are responsible in the sense that they didn't have enough kids. I mean, there's a lot of antinatalism in this country, no question about it. But the idea that there's too many old people and not enough young people at some point has to be laid at the feet of you know, lifestyle choices. People, as societies get wealthier, people generally have fewer kids. That's just the way it is. Now, entitlements, of course, muddy this. About 15% of your paycheck, your half and your employer's half, which could otherwise be paid to you, goes out the door for Social Security and Medicare. So together, they are at least a third of the annual federal budget. And this is, you know, an enormous transfer payment from younger people to older people. As you mentioned, the number of younger workers supporting each retiree has radically shifted since the 30s when Social Security was passed. But beyond that, it creates this you know, intergenerational strife, which I think COVID only intensified, because COVID is the first time where we, well, other than wars, I suppose, but the idea is that older people should sacrifice so that younger people can live, right? That's why we would, you know, we take a kidney from a 40-year-old to save a 10-year-old, not the other way around, right? But with COVID, we effectively locked down the country, at least for a bit, to protect old people from really a pretty small death rate and also an average age of 80-something dying from COVID. So that was obviously insane and wrong. And it created a lot, I think it spurred some more of this intergenerational strife. And of course, you know, older people, baby boomers in particular, have way more money at this age of their life. They have way more money in their 20s and 30s than their millennial or Generation Y cohorts have today. But, you know, a couple of things that go unstated about entitlements. One is that there's a lot of very ordinary older folks who get, you know, $2,000 a month in Social Security, and they have a net worth of $3 million. They may have a modest home, but they own it outright. They have a modest automobile, they have some pension funds, they have some mutual funds. It's very common to have the quiet neighbor next door is worth $2, $3, $4 million, and they're still getting that $2,000 a month from younger people who are working and paying 15% of their paycheck to support this transfer program. Obviously crazy, obviously unsustainable, but more importantly, you know, we're a big far-flung country of 330 million people. We got a lot of immigrants now. We're not sociologically or really culturally cohesive. There's a lot of division in this country. So you take, let's say, a recent immigrant from Central or South America or Mexico who's working his or her tail off at some hourly, fairly low-paying jobs, and this person's getting docked 15% of their pay, so that some old, elderly German Lutheran white woman in Minneapolis who's got $3 million net worth can have her $2,000 every month. That doesn't sound like a recipe for social cohesion.
Right, and besides just the implicit or, you know, unfairness of what you're saying right there, also for the, you know, the current workers to know they're not going to get their promised benefits. Everybody knows the only way this is, quote, going to be fixed is if they raise, you know, like raise the retirement age, increase so-called workers and employer side contribution rates, and cut benefits. And a lot of people talk about, well, maybe we should means test and whatnot, as you're saying. So everybody knows that this is the people that are right now 20 years old. They're not going to be getting the level of benefits that are promised. To give some idea, again, in case people don't know how out of whack the system is right now, the government's own actuaries, this 50 years ago when I looked this up, so you know, I don't think it's moved much, but I think it's probably gotten worse, that this over a 75-year horizon, if they just said, okay, under current, you know, contribution rates and current projections and benefit schedules, there was a mismatch for Medicare and Social Security of, I think it was like $68 trillion, the present discounted value of that. So that was just saying the mismatch, you know, so that keep the current taxes in place. And it was just saying, in other words, they would need $68 trillion right now to have invested rolling over to cover the gap between what those programs are going to owe recipients and what the new workers coming online are going to contribute into the pot. And so that just shows there's no way that's going to work. They're going to have to, you know, cut benefits and or increase the contribution. So you're right, this is clearly unsustainable, and something's going to give, and there's going to be a lot of resentment building. I mean, it's not even just on this thing too. Like when I was growing up, I remember the local so-called public schools, they were going to cut all the sports programs unless there was a big property tax hike. And all the old people showed up at the town hall meeting to complain. And there were all these, like, you know, student athletes there who started crying, yelling at them, and calling them all these names. And it was really just clear how politics was pitting one group against the other. Well, yeah, it's dehumanizing. There's no question about it. But as a political matter, going after Social Security or Medicare is just an absolute non-starter for a candidate at the, you know, running for U.S.
House, U.S. Senate, or national office. I mean, and as for Medicare, you know, the free office visits for seniors that the original Medicare instituted in the 1960s, that actually costs far less money than the free prescription drugs that Medicare Part D passed in 2004 instituted. So, you know, the pharmaceutical companies loved it. All of a sudden, you've got millions of old people across the country taking 10 pills a day, paid for by Uncle Sam. I mean,
that's impossible, Jeff, because weren't the Republicans totally in charge in 2004? So no, there couldn't have been expansion of the welfare state.
Yeah, it was George W. Bush. This was actually in 03 when it passed, and largely as a sop for seniors, so that he could beat John Kerry in that 2004 election. So that's W, the president of Iraq, the Patriot Act, No Child Left Behind, Medicare Part D. Just unbelievable what a scammer that guy was. But, you know, one of the Lawbert reactions to all this is say, well, you know, we got to import lots and lots and lots of migrants from all over the world. That's the only way we're going to be able to pay for entitlements. And whenever I hear this, you know, it's like, well, first of all, I don't want to do that. But second of all, you know, any economy that requires a constant growth in population would appear to be on some level a Ponzi scheme. Now, certainly you don't want to have the kind of demographics that Japan has. You certainly don't want America to become more abundant. We need young people. We need a higher birth rate. We need some dynamism in the economy, and that's generally people under 40, technical skills, etc. We need some degree of smart, capable immigrants. You know, we certainly don't need some of the immigrants we've got, but we need a degree of smart, capable immigrants, and we need you know, a higher birth rate. That's all fine and dandy. But you know, what matters in a society is not just GDP or income or a more Rothbardian or Salerno-like term of gross output. Mark Skousen talks about that as well. You know, something we would agree to that's more accurate than GDP. What matters is per capita, right? I mean, India produces a lot more economic wealth, a lot higher GDP than Liechtenstein, or Switzerland, but no one would say India is richer than Liechtenstein or Switzerland. What matters is wealth per capita, right? Per capita. So yes, just mass immigration of those workers can absolutely raise the economic output of the United States, and even to an extent the economic well-being. But that's different from saying that doesn't necessarily raise the per capita. So I think it's an easy cop out to say, well, you know, it's almost as if we just have a billion Americans, because then if we continue to have addressing the incredible scourge of entitlements at their base level, at their root level. It's not government's job to provide healthcare. It's not government's job to provide for your retirement. Until we address that, you know, what is a billion going to become 2 billion, 5 billion? I mean, you know, India and China both have a population of over 1 billion, but we wouldn't say they're wealthier than us.
Right, and also, I think you kind of just alluded to it yourself too, Jeff, that my problem with that solution, regardless of what one thinks proper immigration policy should be, or even intern policy, but just bringing a bunch of people over, invest that kicks the can down the road, and then you're going to have that problem in the future at some point, you know, the demographic shift. So what I try to make sure people understand when we talk about this sort of thing, it's not something inherent to retirement planning where you need more young people, or at least the same number of young people, you know, going through the pipeline in order to support the retirees, that it has to do with the way the government system right now is called a pay-go system, where, you know, they skim off the top of the existing workers to pay the people right now who are retired, and then it really is like a Ponzi scheme. Like Paul Sanderson and Paul Krugman both referred to Social Security as a Ponzi scheme, and they were saying like, ha, isn't that funny? They were in favor of it, but they were just sort of being ironic. They weren't saying it's academic. And so everybody realizes there is something of that nature going on here, and that's why demographics matter so much. But that's only because of the particular structure of that system. If you had people paying, you know, like when you're a worker and you invested in some fund or all the productive assets, so by the time you were 70, then you started living off of your accumulated savings, it wouldn't matter how many current workers there were, because you in a sense would have already built up the capital goods that would then support you in your old age. So I'm just pointing out that in general, especially like in a freer society where people took care of their own retirement, like that was the default, you don't have these issues. It wouldn't matter, oh my gosh, am I going to be able to retire? Do we have enough young people coming out into this mix? That wouldn't be an issue as much as the current system where it really is like a Ponzi scheme, but that's so important.
Well, if you told most Americans you could have an additional 7.5%, even if the employer didn't share, or an additional 15% in your pay every month, but no Social Security benefits, no Medicare benefits. I mean, I think a lot of people would take that. I'd certainly take that. You know, over a lifetime, I think you can certainly do much better than the rate of return. But what we need to do is we just need to get past this mentality, which is so entrenched. It's just poured concrete, especially amongst baby boomers, that it's my money. I'm just getting my money back. I paid in. Well, first of all, your money's gone. And second of all, it's not that hard to trace out all of your contributions and adjust those for inflation, and then say, well, okay, at what point have you taken out more in Social Security and Medicare benefits than you paid in? I mean, that is something we can calculate. And for most people, it's far more. You know, this is such a good example. You go back to the 1930s. FDR said, look, we literally need an old age pension for widows so they won't be out in the streets begging. Okay, well, that's pretty appealing to most people on an emotional level. And of course, at the time, every legislator who passed the Social Security Act is long gone. Right? They're long in their grave. They never have to account for this. There were 30 odd workers for every potential retiree beneficiary at the time. 30 something. Now they're like 2.5. And the life expectancy in America was 63 or something, and Social Security kicked in at 65. So we haven't adjusted the age. We've reduced the workers paying in. So it's just such an example of, we talk about kicking the can down the road. You can pass an enormously popular, let's face it, folks, let's not kid ourselves, Social Security is a popular program. You can pass an enormously popular program, and literally, in this case, offload the unpleasantness of paying for that program more than, you know, almost 100 years into the future. So that is the fatal allure of democracy, right? You get something now, you pay for it later. In this case, a century later, people you don't even know didn't vote for you, pay for it. So that, you know, I don't know how we get past the psychology of Social Security, because as I mentioned, it's a very popular program, and people fervently believe that because they paid into it, it's their money and it's not entitled.
Right, and it's that was part of the political genius, you know, of FDR. There's even some quote somewhere where, I don't know if he says like this way, no damn politician say they didn't do that because then they could roll it back. But no, this is for everybody. Same thing with Medicare. And once you become a senior, you get this. So once everybody gets it. I read it and I looked through his Twitter. He's kind of one of these Twitter intellectuals, so take that for what it's worth. But you know, he did point out that we have generally in this question, we've erred on the side of older people, and he's quite open about using the term burdens, and many of them are burdens, and that some of them don't want to be burdens, but they're just burdens. And of course, that's economic in the sense that if they're getting nursing care, Social Security, Medicare, they're not working, they're taking more out of the system economically than they're putting in. You know, maybe even what they put in throughout their lifetimes, or in most cases actually more than what they put in throughout their lifetimes. But beyond that, they are a burden in that they're a drag on society. If their kids or grandkids have to deal with them. I mean, he meant burden in the broader sense than just economic. So that's something we got to address. Well, right, and we talked about this offline with this particular guy. He goes out of his way to say real provocative things, and then if somebody gets mad, oh, I was just kidding, I was trolling, gotcha. So who knows, this is supposed to be tongue-in-cheek, but let's take it at face value. Certainly there are people like this Japanese professor who are openly advocating this stuff, and they mean it, so it's not a made-up position, or just a joke. Yeah, I mean, look, there are these trade-offs and cultural things. I mean, it used to be that the grandparents, like certainly in certain cultures, would be living with people and they could watch the young kids or whatever. And so there was a sharing. There was more like passing down wisdom and things like that. So a lot of that, yeah, we don't have it now in our modern American culture where you put them in a nursing home and forget about them, and then it really is just gee, this is really hitting my checking account a lot. And in fact, I don't know if you saw this stuff, but this particular Japanese professor, apparently his mother had some an aneurysm or something when she was young, and he was lamenting how he has to pay a bunch of yen every month just to keep her going. And so that's part of where his annoyance is coming from. So there is that issue. I guess one thing to say is because we had this discussion, let's deport him to Japan. That's my advice. Well, he can closer to his mom, maybe, I don't know where she is. And so look, you don't make those problems better by politicizing it. So I'll just put it that way, that a lot of people, when they see these things, they say, oh yeah, this is why, the family who's like having to pay out of pocket for, grandpa at the nursing home, and it's thousands of dollars a month in the nursing facility. Like, of course, they're going to want to, they're looking at their kid, and how, we got to send the kid to school, or have grandpa just, he's not doing well anyway, he's half senile. But we just had the government pay for it, then those problems go away. We don't have to make these choices, and that, of course, isn't right. That you don't make the trade-offs disappear just by having the taxpayer pay for it. It just means now the family doesn't get to make that choice. It will be public policy. So that's, that's a modest point just to say you're not solving that stuff by making it political. You're just actually taking the power away from the individual families, and now it's going to be some bureaucrat deciding, well, he's no longer worth it. It would be amazing. It would be very difficult, but it would be amazing to attempt to do some sort of sociological study on the the sociological effects of Social Security and Medicare. In other words, how they created more distance, literal geographic distance, among families, because it's possible for grandma to get by, especially also like Medi-Cal, the state-level programs that pay for nursing care. How all these entitlement programs, which are basic welfare, have made it possible for families to be physically separated by much greater distance. But also how the fact that you're going to get Social Security and Medicare if you live long enough skew choices and distorted choices throughout your working life, right? I mean, if you had known that you were on your own for retirement, you weren't going to get that $2,000. Maybe you would have bought the Ford Taurus and vacationed to Disney instead of buying the BMW and vacationing in Europe, right? I mean, there's so much here to unravel in terms of the distorted choices. But on the family level, I mean, look, first of all, without all these welfare entitlements, I think you'd have more multi-generational family living. The elderly people should be contributing financially because they've had their lifetimes to accumulate. And as you point out, I mean, not that long ago, people had children at 15, 16, 17, so the age difference between generations was much lower. So grandpa was 40. Grandpa could help and do things all day, and so could grandma, and they could watch kids and provide childcare. It was more of an economic arrangement. Whereas now, people have their first kid at 40 or something, they're quite elderly. When their grandkids come along, they're very, they're often nursing home 3,000 miles away. So this idea of, well, first of all, a substacker is writing above his pay grade when he starts calling people burdens. I mean, that, who's to say? And that sounds, if old people are selfish here, then he's an example of a selfish younger person who doesn't get it. So, you can't, whether someone's a burden or not, it is subjective. I mean, that's not something any single person can decide. It is a bad way to be thinking about or making public policy. Now,
There's this related article that you and I sent around by Rahm Emanuel's brother. He was the former White House chief of staff. He was a super agent, and his brother is a physician named Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel. And he wrote a pretty famous article in the Atlantic a few years ago. It's paywalled, but it's basically about how he only wants to live to 75. And that while we've radically expanded lifespans, what we have been able to do with our transhumanist grandiosity is increase the quality of life beyond a certain date. So sort of like Richard Hanani, he says, after 75, it's very, very hard to contribute. So that's another loaded word, like burden. I'm not sure what contribute means. I mean, sometimes just having grandma sit in the corner and tell stories might be all the contribution that family needs. So what do you make of Ezekiel Emanuel and all of us checking out at 75 like Logan's Run? Except Logan's Run was 30, I think.
Well, yes, another, I think was it Midsummer? I forget the name of the movie. There was some horror movie where these people go over to this place, and there the culture is that the old people go up and they just jump off the cliff when they reach a certain age. And, oh, it's fine, it shocks you Westerners, but no, we do it over here, because this is our culture in our way. So yeah, I think this is just part of a broader trend that yeah, I mean, I'm not saying anything too profound here, just dehumanizing people. Everything is becoming very commodified. I know it might sound funny for an economist to be saying that, but I can understand the distinction between those things that are in the marketplace and other things of human value. And what's perverse about this, though, just like under communism, they can talk about the class of society, but actually the inner circle, the party, driving around limousines and stuff, that's what's going to happen here, is the people who are politically connected, I mean, they're working on extending human life, and so Klaus Schwab and all his buddies, they're trying to do that stuff. So this is, I think, more about telling the masses, once you get to be 60, 75, you really, your time here is done, why don't you just make room for everybody else? And then you see in numerous arenas this mentality coming across, and I think it's partly because they do see the writing on the wall and know that this is going to be unsustainable in many ways, given the current system, and so let's just start warming people up to the fact that, that they're no longer useful if they reach a certain age.
Well, and to be fair, there are plenty of healthy people over 75 who have plenty of dough and who can still enjoy their retirement, go to Europe or do whatever they want to do. We shouldn't be paying them Social Security if they have lots of dough, but nonetheless. So it's not like everybody in their 80s and 90s is decrepit and incapable of enjoying life outside, let's say, just a family setting with a grandchildren or something. That's not the case. But there's also a huge number of people in their 80s and 90s who are decrepit, who are not enjoying much of the quality of life. And the question becomes, from both an economic and human perspective, how does a society deal with that? And I don't think we've got that figured out very well. I mentioned Logan's Run. People, I don't know if younger people have heard of that movie. I guess would you call that a sci-fi movie, Bob? I mean, basically there was this big sort of place where you went and you stepped onto this rotating wheels, and I think you had to do that at 30, so they wanted to keep this young, beautiful society. And so that was the concept, and you can sort of get a glimpse of that mentality in Ezekiel Emanuel's article. In other words, there's something transhumanist about controlling the circumstances of one's death. I still want to be reasonably cognizant of things. I still want to be reasonably physically healthy. I still want to not have too much pain or loss of eyesight or hearing or mental rundown or other infirmities. I don't want to go through much cancer treatments. I mean, that is you can argue about degrees. That's playing God to a degree. I mean, I suppose you could say a knee replacement playing God or using antibiotics. It's all playing God. But this strikes me as, euthanasia, even the voluntary sort, strikes me as something different in kind, not just in degree. And look, I mean, as far as one's robustness in life, I mean, look, I peaked at 28 or thereabouts. So if I'd been at Logan's Run,
that's 3 years ago,
right? If Logan's Run were, I'd be like Costanza going out on a high note. But I mean, now I'm in my 50s, I'm not quite ready to pull an Ezekiel Emanuel just yet. So I guess the question would be, let's go ask Ezekiel Emanuel on his halfway through his 74th year, whether he still holds that 75. But I don't know how we as a society are going to deal with this aging population, but I do know that government has screwed this up and skewed the way we live. I think that's clear.
Yeah, definitely. So again, none of this solves the fundamental philosophical ethical problems, but in terms of making some of these decisions easier and less abrasive, government intervention at all levels. I mean, I put a lot of stuff on economics, healthcare. If you just got rid of licensure, you got rid of the FDA and the drug treatments and things, that you go through all these hoops and then just maybe put a label on and say, hey, this has not been approved by a government agency, it's taking your own risk. I mean, it would drastically reduce the price of a lot of these treatments. And so you see these ridiculous things of, oh wow, this person wants to get this new advanced drug therapy, but it'll cost the taxpayer $100,000 a year. And so it's because of crazy things like that where you, quote, need death panels, right? Is this, should we play the Paul Krugman clip?
Right, well, but, I mean, give us the context, because the left was denying that such a thing could ever be.
Right, so, I guess it was what Sarah Palin was the one who coined that phrase. But so the idea was, we got to watch out for Obamacare socialized medicine because there's going to be death panels and government bureaucrats are going to decide who lives and dies. And the left was mocking that. These right-wing scare tactics, no one's going to be doing that. But of course, that has to happen. If the government is going to pay for people's medical care, especially as these new treatments become available and indefinitely extend lives, then at some point there's going to be decisions have to be like, no, it's just not worth it to spend an additional $200,000 on this person who, is perhaps comatose. And so, we've got this clip where Paul Krugman, to his credit, was coming out at least admitting that eventually. And so we can go ahead and play that clip.
If they did reality therapy, they should have said, okay, look, Medicare is going to have to decide what it's going to pay for, and at least for starters, it's going to have to decide which medical procedures are not effective at all and should not be paid for at all. In other words, it should have endorsed the panel that was part of the healthcare reform. If the commission isn't even brave enough to take on the death panels people, then it's doing no good at all. It's not educating the public. It's not telling people about the kinds of choices that need to be made. These are all.
What is going to happen? I mean, are you clear on where a compromise is going to be? It's going to be discussed before the end of the year, no?
Some years down the pike, we're going to get the real solution, which is going to be a combination of death panels and sales taxes. It's going to be, we're actually going to take Medicare under control, and we're going to have to get some additional revenue probably from a VAT.
But it's not
One thing about Paul Krugman is he never pays a price for being wrong or being a hypocrite. I think we can safely say that.
Yeah. So it's again you want to take that stuff out of the government, the political arena, but also what I'm saying is it's the reason it's so expensive. It's not just a matter of technology. It's because of government intervention. That if we didn't have this cartel in medicine and so on, all these other ways of limiting competition, limiting supply, prices would come down drastically. People, as you know, Jeff, we got some of our friends who are doing just switching doctors over to cash payment system, and there the prices just come down drastically, just getting the third-party payers out of the equation. So if you made healthcare like a business, it wouldn't have these astronomical costs, and so that's part of the solution. And then families could make their own decisions. People could even put in their will, if I'm out and I'm not responsive, then so-called pull the plug under these conditions. But the trade-offs would be a lot less stark if we didn't have government drastically inflating the cost. So that there's that element at the very least.
Right. Death panel is just an extreme word for trade-offs. Right? I mean, we can accept trade-offs at the individual or family level, but it's going to be a little hard to accept when they're being made by a third-party health insurance bureaucrat or a third-party government bureaucrat. Right? I mean, that strikes me as the dividing line here. And we've all heard stories. Maybe we've even been involved in them in our own families where you've got someone who's quite elderly, perhaps in their 90s, and then some intracranial heart failure or other problem occurs, which is to be expected at that age, and the last week of their life is spent in a hospital bed, and it costs $100,000, right? And they're barely conscious. Their family has to rush to fly there and say goodbye. And there's just not, you don't get a lot out of that $100,000 in that last week of life. But a lot of medical providers get paid, we have to get past that. But again, Medicare is a big part of that. We can't discount the extent to which Medicare distorts that. So I think we have to keep an eye on this and think about this. I mean, we talk a lot on this show about America's economic problems with respect to the dollar, with respect to debt and deficits, but here we've got a problem which is very different because it's demographic. And God forbid if some of these other economic problems become acute, or we have another situation just like 2007, 2008, or even worse than that, I think we're going to find an awful lot more of that intergenerational living that I mentioned earlier in the show. So Bob, I think we will provide a link to Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel's really interesting article about checking out at 75, and obviously he's sort of a left-wing progressive guy, but it's worth, I think, reading it with an open mind. Also, Richard Hanania's Substack on the gerontocracy, and we'll be back next week with another show, so keep the ideas coming. Be sure to follow me at Bob and the Human Action Podcast on Twitter, and I hope you enjoyed the new intro from our engineer, Clay Barnett. You copyright guys are going to love this. We pay a service called BMI to use music, so we switched up the music to a very underrated and often forgotten band from the early 2000s, Palo Alto, the Donnas, one of my favorite bands. So I hope you like the new intro, and we'll be back with a new show next week. Thanks, Bob.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.
State. This is the Mises Institute's Foreign Policy and International Relations podcast. I am here today joined by my co-host, Zach Rico, and this is where we talk about issues that are a little beyond the usual economic topics of domestic policy, and look at what is the United States doing out in the world in relation to other states, and also just discuss some strategic issues and basically how the U.S. regime is getting most of that all wrong. And the latest evidence of that is what was recently released from the White House, which was their national security strategy here for the new fiscal year. And it's awful. Looking at it, this is about, 50 pages of going on and on about global warming, about COVID, about democracy versus autocracy, lots of topics covered here. And basically the impression you're left with is that the United States should use its foreign policy to be involved in basically everything, not just strategic issues related to maintaining defense at all, but
40-year-old writing this for the administration and thinking, boy, we're going to conquer evil here in the next 10 years if we can carry out this report. But really, this report's going to be read in Congress, and then Congress, especially the House, is controlled by Republicans, will pull the parts out of it that serve the Republicans' interests. And so obviously we can't read this as any sort of like something that's about to be enacted over the next year or 5 years or 10 years. But I think it does illustrate what this administration thinks is important, and also I think perhaps illustrates what just the general politics as well. So let's just kind of let's just start out with looking at some of the basics up here. And I would say my main takeaway was that there is no portion of the world that is not considered to be a target for the United States in terms of policy, in terms of meddling, in terms of what they call building bridges. It's just an announcement of every region in the world is of interest to this regime, and we will not butt out anywhere in the whole world. Of course, the problem with that is that it means when every part of the world is a priority, then no part of the world is a priority. So reading this, you can't even guess about which part of the world is most important right now, except maybe for the stuff about how China is the most important strategic challenge. But part of dealing with China involves apparently being active everywhere: Middle East, Africa, Indo-Pacific, Europe, and of course Latin America as well. So you name it. So it's get ready. The entire globe is a place where the United States needs to be spending money, needs to be maybe even starting wars if necessary. And I think a sane person should probably find that to be a little bit alarming.
Yeah, it's such a core aspect of this document, as well as just U.S. foreign policy in general, is the idea of the global order. And it's just foreign policy wonks need to read more Hayek, I suppose, because for them this order is purely constructed. It's a constructivist, rationalist, constructivist entity, as Hayek would put it, and without U.S. involvement everywhere, everything would just collapse. It's sort of a very what's the word? A very codependent relationship. U.S. everyone needs the U.S. The U.S. needs everyone needing it. So all the bureaucrats think under like that's some overriding important purpose. It's the cynical armchair psychologist view of why everywhere is important all the time. Needs us to do something.
Well, and the intro makes that clear, right? Is that the 360-degree strategy is one phrase that is under Joe Biden's signature in the introduction.
Yeah, that paragraph is my favorite line. I'm more confident than ever that the United States has everything we need to win the competition for the 21st century. We emerge stronger from every crisis and overnight. There is nothing beyond our capacity. We can do it for our future and for the world. Nothing is beyond our capacity. During the post-scarcity world, I feel like just one of the core aspects of human existence, as Jesus tells us, is scarcity and the infinite wants that will be unfulfilled. I mean, that's the very core of acting man's unfulfilled wants. So it's just nothing is beyond our capacity. It just flies in the face of basic sound economic logic, and just is sort of mind-boggling.
You know where that line would go really well would be like on one of those like 1930s Soviet Union posters, yes, where there's like a worker and he's looking off into at the horizon or maybe at the sunrise, and he looks all healthy and young and efficient, and then written right under it, nothing is beyond our capacity.
Yeah. I must admit, I do love socialist realist art. Just
yeah, so it would look good,
yeah,
right?
It would. I don't know if it's being from Pittsburgh, the industrial Rust Belt. It's just like, oh yeah, I love that art style. Even though it's propaganda can be, if you recognize it's propaganda, you can appreciate it as an art form in of itself.
Well, of course, I don't mind doing 16th century Christian propaganda reports. Yeah, it's essentially what some of those statues are. And it's beautiful in many cases. So, however, if only this report had some art or flair to it.
Yeah, it doesn't approach Dante's Inferno. All my enemies are burning in hell, and nothing's time. Again.
It reads like a Stalinist 5-year plan in some respects. Like, I'm looking at it, and it covers industrial policy. It has phrases like, markets alone cannot respond to the rapid pace of technological change, global supply disruptions, etc., etc. Strategic public investment is the backbone of a strong industrial and innovation base for the 21st century global economy. This is, when I thought of this, when I saw this, was thinking about how Truman tried to nationalize the steel industry back in the 50s, and just how basically the economy is here to service global investment relations. And that marketing therefore, for the report is there, we need subsidy, we need land, we need all sorts of central government meddling to make sure that the economy is delivering what they think it should do. And it's just astounding that this is American document. I can only imagine something like this being read in 1881. I mean, imagine what the Roman people would be talking about this.
it might have been like I did it in like just just a few years and for continuing the process that was sort of just so bizarre. I mean, there's various reasons for this. I mean, like the United States, I think there are some guys that understood about floppy disks. It's sort of, this is the entity that will, usher in innovation. I mean, here, just on the ground, it's the government's retirement federal repositories, calculator, abandoned mines, sugar mine, everything is on paper. I mean, it's just this vast warehouse filled with file cabinets that is actually bureaucratic efficiency measurement systems. Things are less efficient now than they were in the 70s. This is entirely outdated. It's just the idea that this is the entity that will be at the forefront of leading innovation and research regarding defense or really anything else. It's just so bad.
Well, unfortunately, a lot of conservatives fall, right? They'll 1 minute post about how the government can't do healthcare right, they can't deliver the mail on time, but boy, America's going to use smart bombs in the next war and not kill any civilians, and they're going to install a new regime in country X with the minimal blowback or inefficiency, and it's just astounding when they will describe the ability of the regime, so long as it's along the lines of what we want the regime to do, but they're totally inefficient doing everything else. But of course, experience has shown, hey, let's look at Iraq, let's look at Afghanistan, where neither of those operations were efficient as well, not to mention the $6 trillion spent on them. And then, of course, there's the fact that the Pentagon routinely is failing in audits and it still has $2 trillion missing. And so that should all be remembered when you're reading the strategic report, because this is going to be done by the Pentagon. We have no idea how much money it even spends or where that goes, and has lost 2 wars in the last 20 years. And, they like to blame politicians for it. But part of the justification of those wars is that it would be won quickly, and that it would be easily, and it would be a cakewalk. And especially in the case of Iraq. And none of that turned out to be true. And so it turns out that you actually do need much more difficult problem-solving abilities that apparently the Pentagon lacks. And so there's just way too much enthusiasm about getting involved in every aspect of the globe.
Right, yeah, regarding the Pentagon audit, I can't remember exactly what year, but some law was passed that all of the parts of the government have to have an audit. And for like 20 years, the Pentagon did not do that. They kept getting basically waivers. They're like, well, we're not capable of actually even doing the audit. And then a few years ago, they're like, we're going to do the audit, and they failed every annual audit. Since then, yeah, it's just mind-boggling for media, which is quite depressing.
Well, the fact that right without an audit incentive, remarkably, there wasn't a audit the Pentagon movement alongside should have been every bit as popular. I'm sure Ron Paul would be fine not the Pentagon.
I think it just sort of said, like, I don't know, super wonky accounting. Like, there will be headlines like, oh, the Pentagon, $1 trillion is, missing or something. And it's not like, my understanding, it's not actually like $1 trillion. It's just disappeared. It's just that due to their sloppy accounting, it's just all these accounting errors add up to $1 trillion or more now by this point. But speaking of lost wars, the strategy does mention Afghanistan, and sort of the only positive thing I saw in the document was there were 2 mentions that the U.S. government doesn't want to pursue remaking other societies in America's interest. So when it's like Biden trying to pass off, the document says, we ended America's longest war in Afghanistan, and with it an era of major military operations to remake other societies. So I think, that's helpful signaling, at least, that we don't want to pursue another Afghanistan or Iraq. And I think part of that has to do with the new emphasis on China. We can't afford to be wasting billions of dollars trying to turn Afghanistan into, America when we're dealing with China, which it identifies as basically the main geostrategic threat going forward.
Right, it does. That is the one indicator, I think, that there's some actual priorities contained somewhere in this document. And it correctly notes, of course, that it doesn't, as much as the Biden administration hates Russia, Russia isn't at the level of a major potential global hegemon of any kind. Now, I'm not even sure China is a global hegemon contender, but certainly regional, much more so than Russia, and has just much greater capacity. And even with it going into decline, right? We can look at these numbers on demographics and population and how it might be only 500 million people 30 years from now. But even then, that's it's going to be a place that matters, especially in East Asia. So, and of course, the U.S. wants to maintain its control of the first and second island chains there east of China, and so that's just going to continue to be an issue even if China goes into relative decline. But other than that, as noted, the slide, nothing is beyond our capacity. There's really nothing that is beyond the interest of the regime, and you can see that here when you just start reading part 1 of the report. It talks about the U.S.'s enduring role to important the United States from the world in a way that was horrible global isolationism, because the way the myth goes is that every time something bad happens in the world, the U.S. is too isolationist, the U.S. is too uninvolved. And I remember that big narrative after 9/11. The U.S. had withdrawn from the world and was barely doing anything in the globe. It was just looking inward, which of course was absolute complete nonsense. But that was the narrative. And so, okay, we have the enduring role. Next is recasting the whole world as sort of a Cold War-like competition between democracy
paragraph, they say, it includes our democratic allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, as well as key democratic partners around the world that share much of our vision for regional and international order, even if they don't agree with us, blah, blah, blah. And countries that do not embrace democratic institutions, but nevertheless depend upon and support the rules-based international system. So it's like, that's the exception for Saudi Arabia and Philippines.
Egypt,
Egypt.
right? And we're reacting to each other. Our preferred dictators.
Yeah, and they do say, they do frame it this sort of Cold War, autocracy versus democracy, and then in the final paragraph they say, we don't want to do Cold War. It's like, okay.
Yeah, I mean, they put the world in the and it's remarkable, right, how they then go on to mention Iran, which is significant. Well, I certainly would prefer to not live either in Iran or Saudi Arabia. I would prefer to live in Iran if I was to live in Iran or Saudi Arabia. There's some government officials outside the region have a tight link to the top, not really the case in Saudi Arabia. Their actual, their inherent representation, parliament for Jews and Christians to some extent, whereas those things are basically illegal in Saudi Arabia. And there's just no religion whatsoever under the Saudi, the blood-soaked Saudi regime. But that's something, that's part of the rules-based international order, whereas the Iranians, it's just so, it's disappointing. I don't know if that's the word. It's repugnant, despicable.
Yeah, I mean, the Saudi war, yes.
Right. And I mean, it's just come out of admit, you like the Saudis, that means you have to hate the Iranians, because the Saudis and Iranians see each other. They've been a long game trying to import into the Gulf region. Their enemies, the U.S., therefore, on Iran. It's just such typical hate. I hate the enemy of my friend, but they never ever mentioned that, and you would think that there was no sort of history between the Saudis and Hong Kong.
This really annoying line, comes to my head, and basically, I think this is how everything is always been, including the person I actually was talking about with regards to my land. It's always, as if, like, the idea that people are just completely, they're just waiting to be free, and if they no one supports the government. I mean, this is not true. And it's not many free places the government do enjoy plenty of support, and just it's a sort of our center of that kind of land that I can protest and brutally suppress. A lot of people don't like the government. They're just broken. I mean, they're bringing lands out and loading down. So my point is, it's this whole idea. The U.S. is so big part of the plan. We're going to support the people to institute a new government in line with our conception of the world. So that's the question. Because it's so factually incorrect, like beyond what you're hoping for. It's just not true.
And that was what the number one self-promised in Iraq. And that's what we were told in Venezuela, that nobody supported the regime. And it's still there, and appears to have a significant amount of support. So I guess that's just the standard strategy. Convince Americans that.
Right, and I forget. I think it's ExxonMobil. I can't recall what giant oil company just got a government to begin like exporting Venezuelan crude.
I heard that we didn't end up with a quote-unquote humanitarian station in Venezuela. It seemed like they were pushing for that for a period, but I didn't see really. It wasn't like an dramatic in the section on platform.
Right, yeah, it's sort of like a funny time capsule. That's, I don't know, like 10 years ago when first Avatar movie came out. And one of the mercenaries was like, oh yeah, I fought in Venezuela. So just, people didn't think that back 10 years ago. That could be a realistic place for a U.S. soldier to be fighting. And I do, the document says that the Western Hemisphere is the most important part of the globe for the United States. It's something like $1.8 trillion in trade, yada yada. And I agree with that. And it's like if Sam was king or something and was in charge of institute of foreign policy, our foreign policy would be much more neo and pro-conquer focused. We would be very engaged with the Western Hemisphere. But going back to the line, it's not necessarily. Obviously, it is. I mean, we can't do everything at once. To my mind, the Western Hemisphere is affected because we're concerned about everything in Africa to China to Arctic. I do think we do have some relevant concern for the Arctic, but it's just globe spanning after the Western Hemisphere is just neglected in my view.
Well, they could use actual diplomacy, promote actual friendship with these countries. It's astounding to me that there's not essentially free trade with a much more widespread scale. Yeah, there's like Latin American free trade, but the trade integration is still very dramatic in Latin America. All that stuff you say about how, we can't have free trade with China because they can cut us off from our steel and everything. There's immense amount of resources available. that image is not quite grim, if that does prove to be something that the Europeans would attempt to do, which is just basically show up in East Asia, a place where they have really no well-established relations or military experience, and that they're going to help the United States expand its power there. I mean, it's really is quite remarkable. And if the U.S. wanted to have any real priorities, it would just completely get out of NATO and forget about it. And say, hey, you're rich, you're wealthy, and there's 25 countries here that can get a point outside of this before we don't at all.
Yeah, I mean, if I could say that was a thing or something, I mean, we would cut a deal with Russia right away, because Russia is much more important if we want to balance against China. Not to comment on what we should be doing about China. Russia, it's sort of like funny, like, I don't know, 8-ish years ago, people were like, there's this funny articles about how the close relationship between Russia and China, which was just sort of funny at that time. So this is an aberration of nature. How is this happening? They're not natural partners, but instead we're sort of corralling them into being partners, and it's just sort of this autocracy versus democracy thing. It's very possible. Like, it's very possible that going forward the world will separate into sort of economic blocks, distinct from each other. Exactly because of the power that economics has. There's this very funny line towards the beginning about page 10 of the report, thinking about autocratic governments. They leverage access to their markets and control of global digital infrastructure for coercive purposes. And I mean, when we talk about the global world order, really it's the global American economic order, because of the power of our banking system, we can demand people leverage sanctions against Iran, or abandon Swiss secret banking accounts and change the way they go about their internal economic affairs, because we have that power. We don't want them to have that power. I mean, I agree that it would be horrible to live in a world where China had the power we have to do all these things. It was just sort of making chuckle. Oh, darn, autocracy is doing exactly the whole basis of our geopolitical economic strategy.
It was less than a year ago that we were all talking about removing anyone we don't like from the SWIFT system, the International Bank Transfer Communication System. And what is that about weaponizing the financial system? That's the phrase we're using over and over again. Weaponizing energy, weaponizing technology. But it's only other people. And that was something that really just stuck out about this document, was just the sheer hypocrisy of it. And that's why I say that it reads a lot like a press release. I would have respected the administration and the people behind this report a lot more if they just would have come out and said, we want America to be the most important, most powerful country, and so here's all the ways we're going to use our strategic power to ensure that that's the way it works. And America did it. Now, I would disagree with that, but I would at least respect the honesty and the straightforwardness. And other countries probably would as well, rather than just this patina of, oh, we care about the environment, we care about equity, we care about freedom. And it's just so obvious nonsense the way that they phrase it all, because it's like a laundry list of bad things other regimes do, whereas the U.S. does exactly the same things. A lot of stuff like France interference in the elections of the states. Okay, well, I guess they're just taking cues from the CIA. I mean, it's just astounding that they're putting out these things that I guess you have to be incredibly naive to think that this is some sort of moral law that only foreigners.
Actually, one line I'm very confused on, and it's not my group expertise, but page 26 it says that Russia's efforts to weaponize energy are backed by. That's not my opinion. The situation in Oman earlier this year, Russia, according to record profits, running oil exports. So I found that
In the Twitter feeds on that, right, which is also people I follow, it seems debatable, right, is that they're looking at what is the total volume of oil and gas coming out of Russia versus the amount of money coming in, and Russia must be hurting because they keep making withdrawal, or at least not at all, sanctions. But I agree, clearly, that's not the sanctions on oil gas, definitely not driven a nail through the heart of Russian industry, because they managed to find some partners in India, China, and Africa that are still more than happy to deal with that. Not just Turkey, which is becoming much more of a Russian partner. Boy, Turkey is just brilliantly playing off NATO against Russia and vice versa. Now they're talking about making Turkey a gas hub, more pipelines going through there. Turkey is managing to turn this all into a way for them to basically invade Kurdistan. And so Russia has partners by offering some cover with NATO and demanding there in exchange for not playing too nice with Russia. So it's really quite remarkable. And it's like all the big top support that the U.S. actually managed to well, the standard of this report.
Yeah, there's one line that wants to continue to picture Turkey that's already to the best. And I'll ask in what way? I'm not 100% sure, but I still think that Turkey has, at least at the time of reporting, I think Turkey is clearly the best between NATO
consideration. Maybe they've just decided that, yeah, that wouldn't be worth the trouble after they see the way Hungary and Poland get treated. So maybe that's just it.
So how do you sort of influence them? So, yeah.